Hello, everyone, and welcome to Support Groups 101 Basics for Anti-Sexual Violence Advocates. We have created this content around support groups because we have heard from you, our members, that you are wanting more resources around support groups. So that is why we've created this. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce myself. My name is Ashley Stewart-Griffith, and I am the Advocacy Support Specialist here at the Minnesota Coalition Against Sexual Assault. So my job is to support advocates at our member programs across the state of Minnesota. I do that by conducting trainings, coordinating networking opportunities, and answering technical assistance questions. So I encourage you all to utilize me as a resource. So previous to working at MNCASA, I was a legal advocate in Anoka County at Alexandra House. I worked at a shelter setting in Ann Arbor, Michigan, and I also worked at a children's advocacy center in Louisiana. So that's a little bit of my background here. And I am joined today by Caitlin Tillman, who has a wealth of knowledge about facilitating support groups. So I will let her introduce herself a bit more.
Hi, everyone. So I'm Caitlin. So I have been working with PABSA for about the last 3 years. During that time, I have done several different kinds of groups. So I've done open groups, closed groups. I've done support groups. I've done some groups out at our colleges, as well as doing some closed groups within PABSA, some more intensive groups. And yeah, I graduated from Scholastica with my degree in clinical social work a few years back and have basically just been doing that since then.
All right, so thank you, Caitlin. And yes, we're very happy to have her here. So yeah, if we could go through now, and if you could type in your name, your organization, and what brought you to this webinar. So if you could go ahead and find the chat function and type in the answers to these 3 items in the chat function. While you do that, I'm going to go through some logistics. So right now, all phone lines are muted. We will unmute all lines at the end of the presentation to hear from you. You can submit questions via the chat bar at any time during the webinar. And we will unmute when we unmute your line at the end of the presentation, please put your line on mute until you want to make a comment or ask a question. That way we're just not picking up on background noise until you want to say something. And then when you are done with making that comment or asking that question, if you could then put your line back on mute by pressing *6. And the webinar will be recorded and we will make the link available to you all. We will also be sending more resources around support groups as well when we email out that link to all of you. So let's go ahead. I'm going to pull out the chat function here. Megan Rosencrantz is with me and she is moderating. But let me pull up here. Who do we have on the line? All right, so we have quite a few folks here. I think this is going to be a popular webinar. So we have folks from CADA, from Friends Against Abuse International Falls, folks from SOS, yeah, wanting to learn more about best practices and services, yep. Wanting more knowledge. Always looking for, Stacy is always looking for ways to make support groups run more smoothly. Kathy, I think that's Southwest Crisis Center, is looking to start a support group. So Kathy, you have come to the right place. All right. I think it'll help with your job. Teresa says it'll help with her job to attend the support group webinar. Rebecca is looking for a refresher. Yeah, doing support groups for 10 years. Yeah, this will be a great way just to kind of go back to basics and get a really good refresher. So yeah, okay, if you want to just keep typing that in. Thank you so much for introducing yourselves. So like I said before, this webinar, it's support groups or basics of support groups. So it really is an introduction. So this webinar is going to be a great foundation for folks who have never done support groups before. But it will also be a great refresher for folks like the person who had been doing support groups for 10 plus years. Yeah, this will be a great refresher for people who are really seasoned, and just really an opportunity to go back to basics for an hour and a half here. So I'm going to ask a poll question. So I'm going to pull up a poll, and what I want you to click on is the best answer that represents why you're here. So what is your biggest question or concern about groups? So I have the poll up and I'm going to launch it. And if you could go ahead, I'll give us about 1 minute to answer for you all to participate in this poll. Okay, I think recruitment's in the lead. I don't know if it's going to stay there though. Excuse me. Accessibility is pretty close there too. So we have about 10 more seconds. We have 2 people that haven't voted yet. If you want your voice to be heard, get in here. All right. I'm going to end the poll. I'm going to share the results with you. So looks like recruitment is in first place here. So Caitlin is going to spend some time talking about how she recruits people for support groups and also kind of setting realistic expectations for recruitment as well. Looks like how do I create a curriculum and how do I make the support group accessible are 2 other concerns, which we will definitely be addressing. And then it looks like all the rest of them are kind of tied. So information around facilitation skills, needing to address safety. Am I qualified to run a support group? And I don't even know where to start. So thank you all for participating in that. And we'll definitely address your concerns in this support group, or sorry, in this webinar about support groups. And also, I am a resource even after this webinar today. So like I said, please utilize me. Okay, so our learning objectives. So just kind of want to lay out what we hope you'll gain through this webinar. So the first is that at the end of this webinar, we hope that you will be able to assess what is needed in a support group. So how to be responsive to your community needs. To define what types of support groups exist. To list facilitator guidelines. To identify considerations for setting up a group. And to judge how to navigate common tricky situations within a group. We will spend some time talking about how to start a support group, which I know, excuse me, let me go back for a second. I know that some folks did chime in that they're looking to start a support group, so we'll definitely be covering that. The types of support groups that exist, setting up a support group, the audience or the participants in your support group, screening, working with groups, facilitator guidelines, tricky situations, and evaluation. So what I've heard from a lot of advocates is that support groups are one of the coolest aspects of their jobs. So support groups can be hugely beneficial. They provide hope, support, validation, connection, healing, empowerment, coping skills, information to victim survivors of sexual violence. So they really, really can be a benefit to folks. And most folks on this webinar work at an organization that does receive funding from the Office of Justice Programs. So the Office of Justice Programs, in their guidelines, says that all sexual assault agencies need to be providing supportive group interaction for victim survivors of sexual violence. And they go on to say that programs shall provide opportunities for survivors of sexual violence to participate in safe and supportive group interaction. So it's a little bit broader than support groups, but support groups definitely falls within there. So yeah, so we know that they're beneficial, and we also in some ways have to be providing those opportunities to survivors. So we know that they're beneficial and that we need to do them, but we also need to be, we simply shouldn't be just putting on a support group. We need to be thoughtful and be responsive to community needs. So we need to practice evaluative thinking and create the most useful group for the victim survivors that are in our community. So the first question when we're starting a support group is asking, what is the need in the community? There are many ways of knowing the answer to this question. So you could have, or you could perform a rigorous community needs assessment. Maybe your organization does that, or maybe your local United Way does that, and then you can kind of see those results. So that's a very rigorous way of knowing. However, I suspect that you as advocates know a lot about your community already. So have you noticed that there are a lot of secondary survivors that are reaching out to your group to your agency for services? Have you heard your clients express that they are feeling isolated and would like to connect with others to learn about coping skills? And if you haven't heard these things, then maybe, as you're starting a support group, being intentional about asking the victim survivors that you're working with if they would value a support group, if that's something that they would attend, if they think that's something that will help them in their healing process. So answering this large question, so what is the need in the community, is going to help you determine what type of group you should create, and we'll talk about that in a little bit here. What topics should be addressed, what audience will be targeted, and much more. So before we really get into the nitty-gritty of support groups, I kind of want to zoom out and think about our approach to support groups. So the Resource Sharing Project and the National Sexual Violence Resource Center recently released the Sexual Assault Demonstration Initiative report. Perhaps some of you have read it. And this report really outlines how sexual assault programs can enhance services to victim survivors. And this report looked at a select number of sexual violence organizations across the country, and they noted that there were 5 approaches to services that were identified as integral to improving services to victim survivors. And I'm going to be referring to the Sexual Assault Demonstration Initiative report. I'm going to be calling it the SADE report, so I don't have to stumble over all those words throughout some of this webinar today. So the first approach that they suggested, and actually let me back up for a second. As I'm going through these different approaches, what I would like you to do is if you could think about examples of ways that a support group could demonstrate this approach, or how you could demonstrate this approach through a support group. So as I'm going through these larger things, if you could type in the chat function examples, and then we can review them. So the first one is rooted in anti-oppression and empowerment-based framework. So this is understanding that sexual violence is caused by oppression and exists and continues to exist because of oppression, and that your organization should be ready to respond to marginalized populations within your community. That services are made available across the lifespan, so serving all ages and responding to what healing looks like at different ages. Having accessible accommodations, so making sure that your services are easily accessible by all members of your community. Having a culturally specific response, so being representative of community needs. Having a wide range of settings, so providing services beyond shelter settings. And being trauma informed, so being rooted in the understanding of trauma in the lives of survivors, but also in the lives of people who are serving survivors. So like I said, we will be referring to some of these approaches throughout the webinar. So do we have any examples? No, we have some quiet folks here.
Oh. So this is Megan. Someone shared that they would like to make sure that the facilitator isn't the only one talking or dictating what needs to happen. So as like an example of working with your group, so she also notes that they have a seasoned survivors group for 55 and over women, and then all of their services are trauma informed.
Yeah. So I'm hearing a lot of different things within that. So yeah, having services made available across the lifespan. So having folks, having services for older adults, and then ensuring that your services are trauma informed. Yeah. All right, and we can always go back to this one too. So if you are thinking of things as we're moving forward, we got one.
So someone shared that they have examples of empowerment-based framework by encouraging group members to create their own rules and norms for the group. Yeah. So that seems to be a pretty common one, and one that can be easily implemented.
Yeah, sure. So yeah, Caitlin's going to spend some time talking about that too, but how, when you're setting up a group, especially a closed group, which but all groups need to have guidelines, but really getting input from folks from the group about what they see as important ground rules. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I know it takes a little while to chat in, so if anybody else chimes in, we can come back to this slide with no problem. So, all right, so we kind of looked at things a little bit higher up with our approach. Now let's look at some of the nitty-gritty. So we'll define the different types of support groups. So these types are really categorized by what a participant will get out of them and how they are structured. And most often support groups are lumped into these three types that I will go through. So the first is psychoeducational. So a psychoeducational group will provide emotional support and education. So kind of like what it sounds like, psychoeducational, psycho maybe representing emotional support, educational support. Psychoeducational support groups increase knowledge and coping. They are oftentimes structured and will have a curriculum. And sometimes they can be a closed group, and we will talk more about what that means in a little bit here. The next is a self-help group. Usually a self-help group is a drop-in style, so folks can show up. It helps participants in changing some aspect about themselves. It's oftentimes an open group, like I said, and we'll talk more about what that means. And sometimes they don't have a structured curriculum, whereas a psychoeducational group would have more of a structured curriculum. Self-help is a little bit more looser in regards to that. So one example of a popular self-help group is Alcoholics Anonymous, or a group that we may have all heard of before is Alcoholics Anonymous. The last of these categories is a therapeutic group. So I'm willing to bet that most people on the line will not be conducting a therapeutic group. And Caitlin is a licensed mental health provider, so she can do that. But a lot of us are not and should not be doing these groups. So a therapeutic group is facilitated by a mental health provider, and it focuses more on behavior changes. So just being cautious, that you do not want to be focusing your group on behavior changes as much, and we can certainly provide more information around that. But and also, again, if you are not a licensed mental health provider, you should not be providing therapeutic groups. But you are qualified as an advocate to do the other two. Caitlin, will you talk some more about these groups?
Yeah, so one thing that I always like to frame for any group that you're going to be doing is just utilizing a complex treatment model. So with a complex treatment model, the first step is always having safety and also building some self-awareness with clients. So, how do they recognize themselves within the group? How do they feel about themselves? Something like that works really well is starting every group, again, regardless of what kind of group you're doing, with a check-in, see what's going on in their lives, do a breathing exercise that helps people feel safe, that helps them bring awareness to themselves. The second stage of the complex treatment model is that processing. So really with that, like you're thinking you're just getting into some of the more difficult stuff. So maybe in psychoeducational, like you might start with a check-in and then you go into, maybe you're doing a worksheet about the impact of trauma. So that's where people are recognizing, like, this is how trauma has impacted my life. This is maybe some of the skills that I'm using right now to work on it. So again, you're doing a little bit more of that processing in the second phase. You're doing the hardest part in the middle. And the last phase is that reintegration. So in reintegration, you are preparing to go back out into the world. So you did the hard stuff, and now you're kind of bringing that to a close. And that reintegration is important, again, for safety. Safety is so foundational to group work. So you want to make sure that people are leaving the group feeling safe. You want to make sure that people are coming into the group feeling safe, and you want to make sure that they're supported during that middle part that is more difficult. And that, within every session, that's something that we're working on. And as you're planning out a whole group curriculum, you want to keep that in mind as well. You keep things like a little bit easier, a little bit more surface level at the beginning to allow people to feel safe. And then you always make sure you bring that close to it. So that's what I would like to add about types of groups.
Okay, thank you very much. I thought that was very interesting and some that hasn't quite been framed for me in that way before. So thank you, Caitlin. Okay, so I'm going to take us back to the SADI report. So within these different types of groups, psychoeducational groups, self-help, therapeutic, holistic healing techniques can be incorporated. So I'm showing you this slide. It has a lot of words on it, so I'm going to go through that and break it down a little bit. So as I'm going through this, maybe just being mindful that these different healing techniques can show up in any type of group that you are doing. And the SADI report was really emphasized the importance of holistic healing for survivors of sexual violence. So this could include, as I'm going through here, healing arts, so like art therapy, creative arts, they say here like a knitting circle or a writing group, movement and exercise groups, meditation and mindfulness, yoga, nutritional education, body-based approaches, outdoor-based healing activities, and culturally based approaches to healing. So Caitlin, could you talk a little bit about the different groups that you offer at PAVSA that include holistic healing?
Yeah, so two of the groups that we offer specifically are an art group and a yoga group. So the art group is an open group, so people can just come and go from that group. Sometimes they stay the whole time, sometimes not. Sometimes they're there every week and sometimes not. And I think that's been a really great group to have because the topics around sexual violence can be really hard to put into words. So this has given people a different medium. They've been allowed to express themselves in different ways. Sometimes it's just easier to draw a picture than it is to speak about something. And I think that group has been really great for building supports between survivors, so even if people aren't talking about details specifically, just knowing that they've been affected by something the same way, that they're not alone in their experience. And again, like, even if it's not in words, even if it's just shown through their artwork, that's really cool. And then our yoga group, that's also an open group, but we do a little bit more of an intake for that. So with that group, it's been really good just for survivors to be able to experience their own bodies safely. Again, because trauma affects us on every level. So being able to feel reconnected with your body and feel in control of your body again has been a really, really powerful thing. And again, just like knowing that you're not alone in your experience, because experiencing trauma is so isolating. So I know both of those groups have been really, really helpful for survivors.
Yeah, thank you, Caitlin. Okay, so I had mentioned before that psychoeducational groups are more often closed and self-help groups are more often open. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the difference between an open group and a closed group. So really these groups are categorized by when and how members can join. So an open group, new members are allowed to join at any time. There's no start or end date, and they can be sometimes more predictable or have less consistent members. And like I said before, you'll find that self-help groups are most often open. So Caitlin, will you talk a little bit about considerations for having an open group?
Yeah, so with open groups, we're thinking about, maybe people don't have the time commitment to make it to a weekly group, a closed group, so that would be a good fit for them. Maybe they've never tried a group before. Having an open group is a really safe way to just see what it's like for you to be involved in a group with other people. Or maybe some people don't feel like they want to go into an intensive group. Maybe they're in a place in their life where they've already done that intensive work and they just more want that connection. Or maybe they don't know if they're ready for an intensive group. If I have people that are interested in a closed group, a lot of times I'll recommend them trying an open group just to see how it feels for them. And if that's really overwhelming for them, we might do some more intentional group before they start a closed group.
Okay, yeah.
Consideration.
Okay, and then closed groups, on the other hand, are, like I had mentioned before, oftentimes, or sometimes psychoeducational groups can be a closed group. So all members join at the start. They have a set start and end date. They're more structured, and they might have certain curriculum that you might move through based on how long the group is. So it's kind of more of you can think of it more as a cohort. So Caitlin, could you talk a little bit about considerations for a closed group?
Yeah, so with a closed group, it's really important to make sure that someone is in a stable place in their life. Closed groups are really intentional and intensive. So if there is a lot of chaos, people might be thrown by these groups and it might be detrimental to their mental health. Also, just, the logistics of being able to be there every week, that's another thing to consider. So I think with this group too, speaking from a therapeutic standpoint, you really want people to be able to tolerate those uncomfortable feelings and have supports for those. So typically I ask that people are involved with therapy at the same time, just so they have someone to like really process that with and have that check-in space with, just to, you know, like make sure that they are doing okay as they are going through that intensive stuff. Another thing I'm looking at too is just, you know, are they able to trust in others? Do they feel safe being open and being vulnerable in a group? And then in closed groups, typically, you know, you're going to be connected with less people, but those connections are stronger. So I think if people are really getting to, you know, they're wanting to get to know people on a deeper level, I guess, then the closed group would be more appropriate. If you're just going to like meet people more casually and have those casual connections, you know, then I think an open group would be more appropriate.
Sure. Okay. Yeah, thank you for those considerations. Next, we'll talk about a targeted audience or the participants. So essentially who you want to show up to the group and who the group is for. So again, this should be responsive to community needs. So we're looking at who you're targeting. This should be targeting at folks who are in need of support group services. In support groups, it's important that group members have the same primary experience. So this is important because one of the main goals of support groups is to decrease feelings of isolation and increase validation. And that really can be done in a setting where you're surrounded by folks that have gone through a similar experience to you. So it may make sense to have a group for adults who have survived child sexual assault, but it would not make sense to then invite adults who are secondary survivors whose children have been sexually assaulted, because they would have very different needs. So when you're setting up a group, you know, being intentional about who this group is for and how to kind of cater to that group's needs. Age, gender, identity, and cultural groups. So these are other considerations for your audience. So age, you know, with age, it can be important to limit groups based on age, especially if they're at, you know, different developmental levels. And, you know, having people who are in a similar age can be important also because there's different cultures around age. So for instance, you know, somebody who is, you know, between 18 and 22, let's say, and they're in college, may have a very different experience than somebody who was sexually assaulted as an older adult. However, there is some literature that tells us that having a group open to various ages can actually be very beneficial, that folks can kind of cross those lines and learn from each other and develop different approaches to healing and coping by being in a mixed age group. The next with gender identity, and the reason I bring this up is to be, you know, thinking critically when you are excluding certain genders from groups. So for instance, if you have a group that is a woman-only support group, and if you're doing that because you want this group to have a sense of safety, just kind of thinking about who that's excluding. So perhaps some women in that group have been assaulted by a woman. So, you know, just really following through on the logistics or your logic on that. And of course, you know, just being intentional and being thoughtful about having groups for specific genders. And then with cultural groups, again, being responsive to community needs. So there may be different cultural groups within the community where a support group could be really beneficial to gather folks. And since we see things through the lens of our culture, it may be important to gather folks who kind of share a similar lens, or could be beneficial. Size. There's a question, I guess?
About the closed groups.
Okay. So we'll well, actually, I'm sorry. What is the question?
So the question is a dialectal behavioral therapy group a closed group, for example? I wasn't familiar about a dialectical behavioral therapy group.
It could be, yeah.
Oh, I looked.
Sorry.
So it's a cognitive behavioral treatment developed.
Oh, so Caitlin, do you want to talk about that since you're a therapist?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Sorry.
Yeah, I was just going to say that a DBT group, it could be an open group or a closed group. I know typically up here the DBT groups are closed groups, but I have heard that there are also open groups. So it just depends on how it's set up, and I'm sure like the curriculum within that would probably look a little bit different. So open or closed, just depending, different, probably structured a little bit differently.
And just for those of us that didn't know what it's a type of treatment for a specific type of, or using cognitive behavioral skills.
Yep, dialectical behavioral. Yep.
Thank you. It's very official sounding.
Yes, it is. And then when you're thinking about your size too of your group, so if it's going to be a closed group, and Caitlin and I have kind of had conversations about this, so the literature that I'm pulling up is saying that, if you're having a closed group, really limiting it to about 6 to 8 people, because more than that can kind of get out of control. It can be hard to facilitate. And then of course you want, people in there to really strengthen and enrich the group. Of course, with open groups, sometimes you can have a larger audience depending on like what you're doing and how that's set up. But really, the reason I included this is if you are going to do a closed group, just thinking about having it to be about 6 to 8 folks. Okay, so setting up a group. So setting up a group is going to take a lot of work and time and thought. And so I once heard this quote, and I think it really applies here. So sweat the details so they don't have to. So really thinking through this group so that the folks in it can have the most optimal experience, so that you've dealt with kind of all the little logistical things, so it's not awkward or uncomfortable, or that you're making the most use out of your time by thinking through the little things. So for the group to be successful, you're going to be spending time outside of the group preparing for it. So it's not really something you can just show up and do. I mean, of course, there are really gifted facilitators out there. But I'm going to say most of the population, we have to really think about how we're facilitating a group to get the most out of it. And I would think, if you haven't done a group before, you may be kind of surprised by how much time it can take when you're first starting out. With thought, so really thinking through the details. If you're planning, so you're going to plan an activity to do in your group, thinking about why are you doing this activity? Like, what purpose is it serving in the group? Does it fit the objectives of why this group is here? And thinking too about how long this activity is going to take. So let's say you're meeting for an hour and a half for your support groups, and you do an activity that's really supposed to take like 50 minutes. Well, you're cutting out a significant amount of time in that group. So, is it worth it? Is it not? Are there ways to shorten the activity? So thinking through stuff like that. And also in terms of accessibility, which we'll get to a little bit more, is this an activity that everybody can participate in? And then also, how do you set up an activity with clear guidelines and instructions? So I think you get the sense that just really thinking through a lot of the details. And then you'll need to find ways to get input from the group too, and to utilize that input thoughtfully, and crafting a curriculum with meaningful objectives and selecting it so that it's purposeful. So making the group accessible. So we're thinking about accessibility in a lot of different ways here. So you can see the graphic, the picture on the screen here. So, you know, when we're thinking about accessibility, of course, making sure folks who have disabilities are able to, or who are older or so on and so forth, are able to physically get into the space that you're holding the support group, but also thinking about accessibility in different ways as well. So for instance, if your local church is offering free space for your support group, of course, free space is really great and really, really important. Just be thinking through, who the members of your support group are, and if that's going to be an issue for them to go to that location, or if it's not safe for them to go to that location. So just, again, thinking through how to make the group most accessible to folks. Yeah, and then recruitment, which I think is the most important aspect, or the thing that people are wanting the most information on. So I'm going to let Caitlin take this away.
Okay, so recruitment. So typically when we're thinking about recruitment, we're thinking about recruitment from 3 different places. So we're thinking about from within the agency. So maybe you already have some clients that you want to be in the group. Maybe you're thinking about other professional agencies in your community, or just thinking about the general public. So with these, I kind of outline some pros and cons. So thinking about within the agency, some of the really good things about that is that you're going to know that person really well. You're going to know what kind of groups they're appropriate for. You're going to know if they have other resources, if they have stability, and also that person's going to feel familiar with the agency, which will probably help them feel safer with a group. Some of the cons of recruiting from within the agency, it can be limiting for outside people. You get less people coming into your agency, and there might just be a lot of overlap. So maybe the client is coming in 4 times a week for services, and that's just too much for them. So thinking about other agencies, so some of the really good things when recruiting from other agencies, you get to build connections with those other agencies. You know that that person has other supports. This can bring in some other people, other clients from outside of your agency to come in and do those groups, which can be good for advertising. Some things that can be difficult that I've experienced with other agencies. So maybe the agencies don't have a good understanding of what it is that you're doing. So you might get people that aren't appropriate. So sometimes we get referrals for people for closed group that really they don't have a lot of stability in their life, and that wouldn't be appropriate for them, but maybe they'd fit with another group. And then from the general public, some of the good things are, you really do get the word out to the public more. It draws more people into the agency. Just thinking about accessibility, you want to be open for everyone. Some of the things that are hard is you just don't know the person as well. So again, like evaluating whether or not that person is appropriate for a group or not, which we'll talk about more, I believe, in the next slide. And then you're just having to think more about, especially if that person is in a closed group, what are their connections and their resources? Advertising for the general public, this is like you're putting out ads in newspapers, you're going to be putting out flyers, different things like that. Other agencies, you might be sending letters, and then within the agency, you're probably going to be talking directly to clients as well. So those are some of the things that I consider when I am thinking about recruitment.
Okay. Thank you, Caitlin. So screening, so I'm going to let Caitlin talk about this topic of when you're screening folks for support groups.
Yeah, so we're going to talk about screening for a closed group first, because I do believe that process has to be more intentional, just because it is a more intensive group. So I kind of just put together a list of questions that I really like to consider when I'm thinking about a closed group. So the first question I ask is how recent was their trauma? People that have experienced trauma typically within the last, 3 months, they're still in that acute trauma reaction phase. So really like a processing group is not going to be appropriate for them. It's really beyond like that acute trauma phase that you are able to like process and really heal and build those connections. The person might just have other things going on in their life that they need to handle from that trauma at that time too. So it is good to, obviously make sure that person is supported, but wait until it's been, typically 6 months or more from their trauma until they're in a closed group. The other thing I'm thinking about too is how extensive is this person's trauma history? So is this a person that's experienced trauma from a very young age? Because that does influence their, I guess, the level of impact it has. It affects their ability to participate in a group. There are some things that are unique between experiencing a single trauma and experiencing chronic trauma. So again, thinking about, simple trauma versus complex trauma might differentiate what kind of group a person is in, or, if maybe they need to be in a group specific for that. A person needs to have their basic needs met. If a person is in crisis, it's not going to be a time for them to go into an intensive group. Sometimes people, going to the next question, what are other stressors in this person's life? Sometimes people will like be really, really ambitious all at once. So they're quitting smoking, they're starting school, they started a new job, they're having a baby, and they decide it's the time to start a closed group. I usually encourage people to wait to start a closed group until, the things in their lives are more settled, both so they can focus on those other things and so that they can focus on things in group. We don't want people to be too overwhelmed, and participating in a closed group can be overwhelming in itself. So the next question down, does this person have other complexities, such as severe persistent mental illness, dependency, legal matters? How are they supported? We do have a lot of people in our office and participating in groups that do have a lot of complex issues. So we just want to make sure that they are getting the support that they need across the board. So if someone does have SDMI, make sure that they're connected with their psychiatrist, maybe an arms worker. If they do have dependency issues, where are they getting support for that? Maybe they're involved in like an AA group at the same time they're involved with us. Legal matters, maybe someone has an ongoing case regarding their sexual assault. So if that's happening, how can we make sure that they're supported? And we're really lucky. Yes.
Could you speak up a little bit? I think somebody's having a hard time hearing you.
Oh, sure. Yep. Can you guys hear me okay now?
Yeah, that's better. Yep.
Okay. Sorry.
No worries.
Okay. So next question. So are they connected with other therapeutic resources outside of the group? And that's something I touched on a little bit earlier. So if they're going through a closed group, it is pretty intensive. And we just want to make sure that if their mental health symptoms are being triggered, that they are still getting support for that. So again, that's just important. I usually ask if they've been involved in group therapy in the past, or general therapy. It just gives them a better idea about what that process is going to be like. Or if they've had concerns that have come up in the past, then we can kind of address those at that time. Obviously, in any group, there's going to be different dynamics. So thinking about that next question, how have they managed group dynamics? Is it difficult for them to be in a group with other people? How can I support them in that? Maybe, thinking about what are some agreements we need to set up around dynamics. And then this isn't a question that people think about a lot, but one thing I like to check in on is, what is the person's motivation? So sometimes people are really motivated to do group, to be in a group to help other people. And we want to make sure that they are there for their own healing. The focus should be on them and not healing someone else. A lot of people that we see are helpers, which it is good to help others, but the primary focus needs to be their own healing. So again, managing those expectations. What are they hoping to get out of that group, and what are they hoping to contribute to the group? So then if you want to click on the next slide for me.
Yep.
Okay. So the next one is just thinking about an open group. So we don't screen for open groups. You know, the expectation is that if you have experienced sexual violence, or if you know someone who's experienced sexual violence, you can be in the group. You do not have to disclose your history, and you don't have to do like an intake about how much it affected you, which I think is really good for some people. That is a scary process to go through. So being able to just like go into a group, you know why you're there, you don't have to talk about it, and that's okay. So I typically will set the ground rules for open groups, just because there is more chaos with people coming in and out of the group. So the group agreements that we come up with are always centered around safety. They're always posted, and they're always discussed within the group. So that's just another thing that we like to consider, just to make sure that everyone does feel safe within the group.
Okay. Thank you, Caitlin.
Yeah.
So working with groups. So kind of what does it look like when you kind of have your boots on the ground and you're working with your support groups here? So one thing that kept coming up in the literature as I was preparing for this webinar is kind of thinking about the stages of closed groups. That way you kind of know what to expect and what the group dynamics will be as you're going along in a closed group. So 3 stages that they listed were forming, storming, and norming. And it can be important to recognize these phases, like I said, so you can kind of prepare for group dynamics, but then also think about how you as a facilitator want to design curriculum and design interactions based on these stages. Of course, you know, this might not show up in every single group that you do. They're just kind of some basic guidelines. So at the forming stage, folks are coming into the group, they're new, they may be polite. Some folks may be really polite at this stage. Some folks might be quiet, reserved, and they may not trust you or the other folks in the group. And that's kind of completely normal. So when you're thinking about your activities that you're doing, something that's going to involve a lot of sharing and things that kind of require trust may not be appropriate at this time. The next phase is storming. At this phase, a little bit further into the group, folks may begin to open up and put themselves out there a little bit more. But there also may be more boundary pushing as well. So that's important for a facilitator to think about and to manage the boundary pushing. And there might be more times where you're experiencing conflict within the group. The norming stage is when folks have kind of more towards wrapping up the group. They've gotten used to each other, more comfortable. They may have established some relationships within the group, established trust, and at this point, hopefully are understanding the boundaries of the group a little bit more. So I'm just kind of thinking about what activities may be more appropriate as you're closing up and folks have kind of felt more established and trusting. So yeah, so Caitlin, I'll have you talk about ground rules.
Okay. So thinking about ground rules, so like I said in the last slide, ground rules in open groups are typically set by the facilitator. That's what I stick to, just because there's not an opportunity for everyone who's going to be involved in the group to sit down and have that intentional discussion. In closed groups, it is a very intentional process that we are doing basically right at the beginning of the group, right in the first session. You know, we sit down, we talk about concerns, we talk about ground rules, and those are all set, and all of the participants agree with those. Then there's also that buy-in with them. So moving on down to emotional safety planning. So again, did you have anything else that you wanted to add in on ground rules, Ashley?
No, I didn't.
Okay. So emotional safety planning, that's also something that we will do right up front in groups. And that's also thinking about the trauma treatment model. How do we build self-awareness? So recognizing that maybe you're not feeling emotional safe right now. What are resources that people can have? Within closed groups, one of the other first things I have people do is make a safety plan. So they have the resources, they have people that they're going to call. They're really planning for all of those, like, what if, like, what if this is really difficult for me, or what if I get triggered? Who am I going to talk to if I'm having a hard time? And then moving on to confidentiality. So regardless of the group, everything that happens within the group is confidential. We let participants know that if you see another person outside of the group, that you don't acknowledge them unless they have said that they want to be acknowledged. That just makes sure, like, people are protected. Maybe they don't want someone else in their life to know that they're in a support group. I'm also a mandated reporter, and typically a facilitator, is going to be in a role where they are a mandated reporter. So that's all told to the participants so that they do know that going into the group.
Caitlin, do you have folks sign a confidentiality agreement, or are you more just talking about it within your groups?
We are typically just talking about it, but I do think it would be beneficial, especially in a closed group, to have them sign a confidentiality agreement. In an open group, just because there are so many people, like, coming and going, it would be difficult to have everybody sign a confidentiality agreement. So we just have it as an expectation. And as far as I know, we haven't had issues with people breaking confidentiality outside of group. So I do think that in general, people trust each other.
Yeah. Well, it's great that you haven't had that experience. So, yeah. All right. So I will move us on to facilitator skills. So we'll go through some guidelines for what a facilitation can look like, and some, I guess, like best practices around that. And I'm going to let Caitlin do most of this, and I'll chime in where I think it's necessary, I guess.
Okay. So these are just some things that are really important to be grounded in as a facilitator. So as a facilitator, you are just a facilitator. You are not there to dictate an entire group. It's really important, thinking about the empowerment model, that participants feel like they are in control of their own group. Group members really have a lot of their own experiences, and it's really good for them to be able to share them with other people. As a facilitator, it's not about our own personal experience. Thinking about enforcing ground rules. So it is the role of the facilitator to maintain safety in a group ultimately. So, first of all, we need to be a model of that. We need to make sure that we are enforcing the rules for ourselves and following them for ourselves. And then we need to call people out if they are not doing that. If someone isn't following the rules, it can jeopardize other people's safety. Again, so safety is the bottom line. So make sure that they're safe.
I was going to share too. I came across some research that pointed to that of people that did not enjoy support groups or did not benefit from them. People who said that they did not benefit from them stated that one of the reasons that they did not like support groups was that they did not feel like the facilitator enforced the ground rules, and they felt that they were being harmed by other folks in the group. So this really is important too. So we can go on to authentic humor and humility. And Caitlin, we remind you again, if you could speak up a little bit more.
Oh, yeah, sure. So our phones here are not the greatest at work. So
Oh.
yeah. Can you hear me okay now?
Yep.
Okay. So thinking about authenticity, humility, and humor. So it is really important to be yourself. Be true with your experiences, own your mistakes if you make it, really allow yourself to be yourself. That being said, I think there's a big difference between being authentic and like disclosing everything. So be yourself, but also use yourself judiciously. I like the term judicious use of self. So if you are telling a story about yourself, like, is it really appropriate to do, or is it not? Is it something that like maybe one of the participants could tell their own experience instead of you, you know, thinking about things like that. I think participants also know when you're not being yourself, and then they have a hard time connecting with you. They don't feel safe to be themselves either. So be yourself, and it is okay to laugh in groups too. People generally like it when there's humor within groups. It makes them feel more comfortable.
Sure.
Yeah. And then I think, do you want me to speak about being intentional as well?
Yeah. Yes, please.
Okay. Yeah, so I think, of course, it is important for us to do everything intentionally when we are setting up a group. I really like what Ashley says, just thinking about the purpose of everything. So always ask yourself why you're doing something. Does it lead into the mission of the group? Does it follow in within that safety framework? How is it going to help people? Thinking about that.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's good to keep a structure, so thinking about flexible for group needs, but staying on topic. So a lot of our groups, we set up a structure for it. We have an outline of what's going to happen during the day, but within that, it is flexible. People have the opportunity to talk about their own experiences, to adjust for what they need. Every group that I've done, we have like different break times because every group needs a different break time.
Mm-hmm.
But having that general outline just helps people feel more comfortable and more safe because they know what's going to be happening next. Groups that we do, we also always have 2 facilitators. I think this is important because it is difficult to be a facilitator. So when there are 2 of you, you can look to each other for support. You can kind of process through what's been happening in the group. Also, like if you need to take a break or something yourself, you have another facilitator there. If someone gets really triggered, they can go with one of the facilitators while the other facilitator remains in the group. So I do believe that it feeds into a lot of safety as well. If for some reason you can't have 2 facilitators within a group, I would just be really intentional, with the agency that you're at, make sure that there is another support person somewhere available within the agency. We have had people had to leave groups before and talk to someone one-on-one. So just thinking about how can that be provided. And just also thinking about if you're facilitating a group alone, where are you going to get that support from? Is there someone else that you're working with, that you can kind of debrief that group with? And then just thinking about supervision as well. That's just another check-in person for you to make sure that you are doing an appropriate job, that you're getting the support that you need. I think it's really good to just have that like back and forth conversation with a supervisor too. Maybe if you have ideas about curriculum and just want an outside person's perspective. So, thinking about another resource for yourself as well.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Caitlin. And so we're going to go through some tricky situations that may come up in groups, and Caitlin's going to talk about how she kind of mitigates some of these challenging situations.
Okay.
First one is,
Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
Oh, no, you're fine. We're good.
Okay. So unfortunately, some of these tricky situations I have had to problem solve as they have come up or as they've came up. So I really like to plan beforehand. So these are situations that you do see from time to time. So use of alcohol and drugs. So it's really helpful to have the guideline there beforehand. So as you're starting a group, or if you have an open group, if you don't feel comfortable with people using alcohol and drugs within that group, then that should be a rule right up front. You know, if that does happen within the group, obviously, I've had situations where I've had to ask someone to step outside of a group with me if they're under the use of alcohol and maybe being disruptive to a group. That's where it's really helpful to have 2 facilitators. So set your guidelines and be clear on those and have a plan in case it does happen. With severe and persistent mental illness, you know, just making sure, again, that people are really getting the support that they need for that. If their mental illness is, you know, really, if they're really struggling with it at the time, maybe talk to them about moving to one-on-one, just so that they can get support for that. Again, helpful to have 2 facilitators so that if there is a person with maybe more needs, you know, one person would be able to sit with them. Transportation, I think it depends on the agency. I know we utilize MedCab a lot for people. We also provide transportation, you know, we'll provide bus passes. We'll also pay for a cab for people to come to closed group. But again, it depends on like what your agency policies are and if you have the means to survive or the means to provide for that or not. Another thing that's really tricky that does come up a lot within group, so facilitators are commonly asked if they are a survivor. So I find that participants are usually asking this because they feel really alone in their experience again. So when I've been asked of this, I just say that, you know, that it's not about my story, it's about their story. And they know that they have other people around them to support them. I'll acknowledge that it's kind that they like care about my experience, you know, because they want to know that they have an impact on me. But I don't believe that it is appropriate for a facilitator to disclose their own story, you know, in a group setting or in my experience in individual therapy as well. And then rules around touch. This is also another tricky one. So as a general rule, I do not ask for hugs. I do not, you know, sit too close to someone. I don't, you know, pat someone on the back or anything. Times that this has been okay. So if clients ask each other for a hug and they're both okay with it and there's been a lot of safety, then it's okay. It is my job as a facilitator to see, you know, if someone doesn't feel comfortable or safe with that, then to just set a rule that there will be, you know, like no huggings, no patting on the back or anything like that. Again, so just as a rule, I do not give hugs. And then check for safety and comfort level with everyone else, you know, and really talk about consent as well.
Okay, thank you, Caitlin. So we will go on to evaluation. So of course we want to be evaluating our groups and being thoughtful about how we're evaluating them. And we do often get some questions around evaluation too. So when we're looking to do an evaluation of support groups, really thinking about what are your goals? Like what are your goals for your support group? Because those are really the things that you're going to want to measure. You're going to want to measure if you're meeting your goals. So say one of your goals is that the participants in the group will increase their coping skills. Then when you do an evaluation, you're going to think about ways to assess and to learn if folks in that group have in fact increased their coping skills. And perhaps you ask this question in a survey or it's something that you get information around through a focus group of your support groups. And also thinking about why you want to do an evaluation. So one reason that you might want to do an evaluation is to think about or to recognize where you need to be making improvements and where you need to be making changes. And that also too, we are oftentimes funded to do evaluations, we also are required by our funders to do evaluations too. So making sure that the evaluation is fitting our obligations to our funders too. So that's really also going to help shape what the evaluation looks like. And then what questions do you want answered? So we're not going to just be asking questions because we're curious about something or that we think it sounds like a good question, which I know sounds kind of like I'm oversimplifying it, but I think sometimes that actually does happen. So we really need to be asking the right question to get the right feedback. So I kind of like this graphic here with the tool. It's called the evaluation tool, and with a peanut, and there's this man saying, you know, there's a problem with the nut, when actually in reality it's probably a problem with the tool. So if we're not using the right tool, we might not be getting the right results that we or we might not be getting the right answers to the questions that we have. Since we talked about being trauma-informed within the approaches listed in the SADE report, want to go through some ways that you can be trauma-informed when you're collecting data for your evaluation. So the first one is to involve staff, and I know a lot of folks here on the line are not necessarily in leadership positions, so you would, I guess, be who we're talking about here, because you really are the people who are working with victim survivors. You are going to be the ones that are going to be handing out the surveys and telling people the importance of filling out the surveys. So it's really important that you be involved and you give input to what the evaluation process and data collection process looks like. Another way to be trauma-informed is to not collect data when there's a crisis situation. So of course we want to gather data, and it's really important. If it really is a crisis situation, it's not going to go well if your main priority is collecting data, which of course I know as advocates this probably comes pretty easily to you, but I think it's important to say. Being anonymous with your data collection, so folks can really share the information that they want in a safe way. Being open and transparent with your data. So sharing the results with the victim survivors in the group can be helpful too, or sharing evaluation reports and sharing it across agencies too. So just being open and transparent, and also within that too, telling people why you're collecting data and how it's going to be used is really important as well. You should be collecting data often, but not in a way that burdens clients. So maybe this means that you're collecting data at the end of, you're maybe doing a pre and post evaluation for a closed group, or doing evaluation at the end. So you're not doing it, you're not collecting data to the point where you're burdening folks, but you're still collecting it often to get good information. So as we're kind of closing up the presentation portion of the webinar, I'm going to talk a little bit about the Sexual Assault Demonstration Initiative report again. So they did, through this report, outline what are good core services and good comprehensive services in terms of support groups that really are being responsive to the needs of sexual violence survivors. And these aspects, these services have been mentioned throughout our support, or through our webinar here, so I'm just going to kind of go through them. So the first is in the core services, so kind of like the nitty-gritty, basics, bread and butter, is that groups will exchange information, share techniques for problem solving, and explore feelings. So that really, to me, sounds like a psychoeducational group, some of the things that we've been talking about. It may be run by an advocate or a counselor. You could have peer-led support groups too, so having a victim survivor be really taking the reins in that. And I think Caitlin kind of spoke to that to a certain degree when she was talking about how facilitators are really there to, what it sounds like, facilitate and not to lead. They may be curriculum-based, open or closed, short-term or ongoing, be culturally relevant, and have sexual violence-specific groups too. So sometimes at dual agencies or multi-service agencies, we may have the propensity to want to lump everyone into the same group, but like we talked about before, it is important that the primary experience of people coming to the group be very similar. And then if we're looking at comprehensive services or core services plus, another way they described it is really thinking, you know, these are kind of going above and beyond, but something that we should really strive for. And these really are groups to certain populations. Again, like I said before, support groups can be really beneficial because you are gathering of folks who have the same primary experience. So we're going to review our learning objectives today. Way back an hour and 15 minutes ago, we talked about our learning objectives for the day. So now that we have gone through the presentation, we hope that you all will be able to assess what is needed in the support group. So we talked about asking that question, you know, what are the needs in the community, and that will help you determine if it's going to be an open, closed group, what the target audience is going to be, and more. Define what types of support groups exist. So we looked at open groups and closed groups, and within that, also looking at psychoeducational, self-help, and therapeutic groups. Listing the facilitator guidelines. So we talked about things like having 2 facilitators, getting supervision, being authentic, having humor, humility, and more. Identify considerations for setting up a group. So we looked at accessibility, at the audience for groups, and the size. And then judge how to navigate common tricky situations. So Caitlin went through some of the situations that come up in groups in regards to alcohol and drug use, to touch, and to also being asked if you are a survivor in more situations as well. So now we are going to make time for questions. So Megan, do you know how many people are on?
Mm-hmm. About 30.
So there's about 30 of you, so it's not a huge group. So I know sometimes people can be kind of quiet because they think that there's a lot of people on, but I just want to let you know there's only 32 of you. So if you want, during this question and answer period, you can type in the questions in the chat bar if that's more comfortable for you. Otherwise, we can go ahead and unmute your line here. I just have to pull this up. So I am going to go ahead and unmute you, but if you want to, if you could on your own mute yourself until you want to ask a question, I would appreciate that. Otherwise, I may need to go through and mute you if there is background noise.
And so a question's been asked is about getting the PowerPoint slides, and so we will be sending those when the there's a recording, and the follow-up will be sent, and so the PowerPoint slides will be in those after the webinar.
Yep, and we'll also be sending out some information or some more resources too in a document for you. Some of the resources that we've looked up as we're preparing for this webinar.
Someone asked where they can find some good curriculum.
So I can talk just a little bit about, so 3 of the resources that I am sending out after this webinar One is a curriculum. Actually, the Washington State Coalition of Sexual Assault Programs, they've done a lot of work around support groups, and they have a lot of resources around support groups and curriculum. So I will be sending out curriculum for a support group for teens, a curriculum for a support group for survivors of intimate partner sexual violence, and then a curriculum for psychoeducational groups. Caitlin, do you know offhand some other good curriculums that we can talk about?
Well, I'm just thinking about Stephanie Covington's curriculum that she has. I know one of hers, it's called Beyond Trauma, and that's specifically for women that have experienced sexual violence. And that's just a really, really great curriculum.
How do you spell that person's last name?
So
do you know?
Her last name is, it's Covington.
Covington, okay. And that's Beyond Trauma. Okay, I could probably send that as well.
And then there's another question on what thoughts we have on group members sharing information, specifically particular names like of perpetrators. So this is a question about like confidentiality.
Well, so like within the group, folks talking about like, this was my perpetrator.
Yeah.
Okay. Caitlin, I'll let you take that one.
I think it depends on the group, I guess. So obviously everything they talk about in there should be confidential, and I think people should be allowed to speak about their perpetrators openly. You know, if they don't say their names, it can almost feel like they're protecting them. Unless there's some sort of like policy that they shouldn't be talking about them, or maybe there's like an ongoing legal case where they can't be talking about them, then I think it would be fine to talk about them, and people should be allowed to if they want to.
Okay. All right. If you have other questions, you can feel free to type them in. Otherwise, you could also ask via your phone. Okay. Has anyone had a male who identifies as gay in a women's support group? Caitlin, have you had this situation?
I have not. So typically our closed groups have just been women. And in our open groups, not that I have personally worked with.
Okay.
I think that's something too, you know, like you talked about, just like considering those dynamics, you know, and it's not always a male perpetrating against a female. You know, it can happen in many different ways.
Sure. So we have males who come to group and males who have identified as gay.
So there's some comments that have been made that the participants can't see, but some have said that they've had transgender individuals attend support groups that maybe traditionally were just for women, or only women had come to them, and then some have said that they have had individuals as gay. So
okay. And it went wonderful.
Yeah, people said it went wonderful. So yeah, I think that's a good idea to just check in and see how your members feel. And I know we've had occasionally when we've done some site visits, some people have talked about like if there's other support groups, or like if you have someone that you don't feel like is a good fit for your group, or someone feels uncomfortable, if you can find other support groups, and maybe it's not specifically sexual violence focused, but something in a different culturally specific group that can help them.
Yeah. Yeah, so the one thing when you are typing in comments too, there's like a little drop down menu. So if you want your all attendees to be able to see while you're typing, you could click on the drop down menu and say all panelists and attendees. So some of you are not able to see everything, so thank you, Megan, for restating what some folks have said. So yeah, I mean, the target audience, sometimes it is important to put parameters, but sometimes, sometimes it's not important too. So you're just kind of weighing that. And then, so we did lots of discussion of how or if we should prep other members, decided to focus on acceptance of diversity in our group prep with members. Yeah, I mean, so this really can be, and Caitlin, you can tell me more or say more about this too. So, I mean, this really can be an opportunity for groups or for people in your groups to be more accepting of diversity and other folks in your community. And, if they've had the same primary experience, they may have more in common than they think. So I think, yeah, it can be a really powerful experience for folks to get to know people who are maybe a little different, but still having that.
Yeah, I don't think we all have to be the same to support each other either, I think just keeping that in mind.
Yeah, we don't want to spotlight. Yeah, I think, if you're prepping other members, it's probably pretty obvious, or, who the other person is, that may be, like we've said, gay or transgender, maybe kind of outing them or spotlighting them, or when maybe you don't need to. So.
Yep.
Okay, well, if other questions come in, I will certainly address them, but as we're kind of wrapping up, again, I've said before, but you all will be receiving the PowerPoint, and you'll all be receiving a document with some more great resources that you can utilize. And then if you have more questions too, feel free to go ahead and connect with me, and I can certainly do my best to pull up information and to try my best to answer your question and be supportive to you. So it is almost 1:30, so we are right on time. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to end this meeting. I just want to say, or end this webinar. So thank you all so much for attending, and we look forward to continuing conversation. And also, too, if you have more ideas for webinar topics, please feel free to let me know, because you definitely want to be accommodating to that. So thank you.